Snow swallowed the town of Iron Hollow in a single night. Roofs collapsed, roads vanished. People who had lived there their entire lives suddenly found themselves trapped beneath a sky that would not stop falling. And while the wind howled and the temperature dropped below survival, there was only one place still standing, a forgotten stone cellar beneath a ruined building that no one believed was worth saving. Inside that cellar stood a quiet former soldier and his K9, a dog trained for war but now fighting a different battle, against cold, against fear, against the silence that comes before people give up. When the storm reached its worst, the very people who once doubted him began pounding on that hatch, desperate for warmth, desperate for one more chance. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Iron Hollow, Montana, sat in a shallow bowl of dark hills where winter arrived early and stayed late, as if the season had signed a lease. By mid-November, the sky already looked scrubbed thin and metallic, the kind that made daylight feel borrowed. Wind came down from the ridgelines in long, steady pulls, threading through the streets with a noise like distant surf and flinging dry snow into the corners of abandoned porches. The town's main road, 2 lanes of cracked asphalt, ran past a shuttered diner, a bank with plywood over one window, and the skeleton of an old lumber mill whose smokestack stood like a dead finger pointing at a cold heaven. Everything smelled faintly of pine resin and old machine oil. People here measured time by what the weather allowed them to do, and lately the weather allowed very little. The Calder Boone arrived just before dusk, tires crunching over gravel that had been packed into ruts by decades of trucks. His pickup was an older model with a dented tailgate and a canvas duffel strapped behind the seat. It wasn't the sort of vehicle that drew attention in a logging town. If anything, it blended into the landscape like a scar. The thing that made heads turn was the dog. A German shepherd rode upright in the passenger seat as if he had a job to do, sable coat thick and weatherproof, muzzle darkened to charcoal, eyes in amber that caught whatever light remained. One ear stood up straight, the other held a slight kink near the tip, a healed reminder of something sharp and fast. A black working harness sat snug over his shoulders. The tag on the harness read Rex in block letters, scratched from use. Calder parked across from a sagging feed store and killed the engine. For a moment he stayed still, hands resting on the steering wheel, as if listening for a sound that might tell him he'd made a mistake. He was 40, broad-shouldered without being bulky, the kind of build that came from years of carrying weight the body didn't complain about until later. His hair was dark brown with a few silver threads at the temples, cut close and practical. He had a short beard, more shadow than style, framing a jawline that looked carved, not handsome so much as durable. A pale scar ran along the right side of his neck, half hidden by his collar. His eyes were gray-blue, steady in a way that often made people lower their own first. He moved with a controlled economy, not stiff, but careful, like someone who'd learned the cost of wasted motion. Rex looked at him once, a brief check-in. Calder tapped 2 fingers on the dog's shoulder strap and said quietly, "Easy." The dog's chest rose and fell in a calm, measured rhythm. There was discipline in him, but not hardness. The way he watched the street suggested he believed it was his responsibility to keep the world in order. Calder stepped out and the cold hit him like a slap, sharp enough to sting the inside of his nose. The wind cut along the storefronts and tugged at his jacket. He wore a green and black plaid coat over dark layers, blue jeans and boots whose soles had been replaced at least once. He rounded the truck, opened the passenger door, and Rex hopped down with an athletic grace that didn't match the tired look in his eyes. The dog was around 6 years old, past the reckless puppy stage but still powerful, his gait smooth, his nails clicking once on the frozen ground before he found traction. They drew attention without trying. A man by the feed store window paused mid-sip from a paper cup. A couple passing in an old SUV slowed as if considering whether to stop or keep going. Calder ignored it. He'd learned over years and places that towns like this had a way of measuring strangers before they spoke to them. He clipped the leash to Rex's harness and crossed the road toward a low brick building with a brass plate by the door that read, Harlan and Pierce, attorneys at law. Inside, the air smelled of radiator heat and old paper. A woman at the front desk looked up. She was in her late 50s, short and sturdy, hair the color of steel wool pulled into a tight bun. Her glasses sat low on her nose, and her expression held that careful blend of suspicion and boredom that came from a lifetime of dealing with problems that weren't hers. "Can I help you?" she asked, and the question sounded like a gate being tested. "I'm here about an estate," Calder said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "Boone." Her eyes flicked to the dog. Rex sat without being told, tail still, ears forward. "Dogs aren't allowed," she began, then hesitated. Something about the animal's posture, too trained, too purposeful, made her adjust. "Is he service?" "K9, Calder replied. He didn't elaborate. He didn't have the habit of explaining himself to strangers, not unless it mattered. A door opened down the hall, and a man stepped out. He was tall and narrow, with an angular face, hair thinning at the crown, and combed over with more hope than effect. His suit looked clean but tired, like it had been brushed 1,000 times. "Mr. Boone?" he said, already extending a hand. "Calder Boone." Calder shook it. The lawyer's hand was dry and cold. "Pierce," the man said, and smiled like someone who practiced on mirrors. "I'm David Pierce. Come in." Pierce's office was cramped but orderly, with a filing cabinet that had seen better decades and a framed photograph of a fishing boat leaning into a wave. Calder sat on the chair that creaked when he shifted. Rex lay down at his feet, head on his paws, eyes tracking the room in a slow sweep. Pierce slid a folder across the desk. "Your great-uncle, Walter Boone," he began. "He passed last month. Heart, they think. No family in town, no wife, no children. He left behind a parcel outside Iron Hollow, old mill outbuilding, a small plot, some timber rights that haven't been worth much since the mill shut down. He named you sole beneficiary." Calder opened the folder, eyes scanning the paperwork with the same careful focus he used when checking equipment. "Why me?" he asked. "I never met him." Pierce leaned back, fingers steepled. "He kept up with the family line, I suppose. He wrote that you were steady. That was his word. Not sure what he meant by it, but he was particular with language." "Steady," Calder repeated, tasting the word. He'd been called many things. Steady wasn't one of them, not in the years after he came back. Pierce cleared his throat. "I won't sugarcoat this. The property isn't comfortable. Walter lived rough. The outbuilding is in disrepair. The town doesn't consider it an asset. Most folks assumed it would be sold for scrap when he died." Calder's gaze lifted. "Assumed." Pierce gave a small shrug. "I'm telling you how Iron Hollow thinks. It's not personal. People are cautious here. Winter makes everyone cautious." Calder signed what needed signing. He listened without reacting as Pierce recited legal obligations. He asked only one practical question. "Keys?" Pierce pulled a ring from his drawer, 2 keys, dull with age, and a small brass tag stamped with the number 17. "Gate lock and main door," he said, "if the main door still exists." When Calder stood, Pierce's smile returned, thinner now. "If you decide to sell," he offered, "there are buyers who—" "I'll see it first," Calder said. Outside, dusk had thickened. Rex's breath came out in pale bursts. Calder drove out of town along a road that narrowed into packed dirt, flanked by stands of pine and birch. The world grew quieter the farther they went, as if the town's last bit of human noise had been left behind like a dropped tool. After 10 miles, the trees opened to a clearing where the old lumber outbuilding sat. A long, low structure of weathered boards and corrugated metal, roof bowed, one side wall listing outward like a tired shoulder. Snow had drifted against it, piling in uneven banks. The place looked less like a building than a memory of one. Calder killed the engine again. This time, he didn't sit. He stepped out and stood still, letting the wind run over him. Rex jumped down and immediately began to circle, nose close to the ground, reading the place the way others read signs. The dog's tail stayed level, not wagging, not tucked, alert, not afraid. Calder walked toward the main door. The padlock on the gate was iced over. He used his glove to wipe the keyhole, slid in the key Pierce had given him, and turned. The lock resisted, then gave with a brittle click. The sound felt loud in the quiet. He pushed the gate open and it squealed, metal complaining like a warning. At the outbuilding's door, he found what Pierce meant. The door still existed, but only barely. One hinge was bent, the frame warped so that the key turned, but the latch didn't fully catch. Calder shouldered it open. Cold air spilled out, stale and sour. Inside, the floor was littered with old sawdust turned damp, broken pallets, a toppled workbench. Along the back wall, an iron stove sat half buried under debris. A narrow set of stairs led up to a loft that sagged as if it was thinking about giving up. There were signs of someone living here once, an empty tin can, a cracked lantern, a pile of rags, but nothing that resembled comfort. Rex padded in behind him, ears forward, nose working. He stopped near the center of the room and looked back at Calder, an unspoken question. Calder understood it. "Is this safe?" "Not yet," Calder murmured. The wind forced itself through gaps in the wallboards, making the whole structure breathe and groan. Calder stood for a long moment, letting the reality settle. He could picture how the cold would deepen, how the snow would load the roof until it gave. He could picture the town's faces when they heard he'd come to claim this. He didn't need Pierce to translate Iron Hollow's opinion. Rex moved again, slower, deliberate. He crossed toward the far corner where the floorboards looked darker, more swollen by moisture. He sniffed once, twice, then pawed at the wood. A hollow thud answered, different from the rest of the floor, deeper, more solid beneath the rot. Rex pawed again, more insistently, and then sat, eyes fixed on Calder as if he'd found the one thing that mattered. Calder stepped closer, crouched, and pressed his gloved palm to the boards. Under the cold, he felt it, stone, firm, and unmoving. He tapped his knuckles. The sound echoed, dull and promising. He looked at Rex and exhaled a thin cloud into the dim air. "Good catch," he said. Outside, the sky went from iron to black. The wind rose and snow began to sift through the cracks like flour. Calder didn't move away from that spot. Something in his chest, long quiet, shifted. An old instinct waking up, the one that said shelter wasn't found. It was made. He set his hand on the floor again, and for the first time since arriving, he allowed himself a thought that wasn't caution but possibility. Whatever Walter Boone had left behind, it might not be worthless at all. Calder did not waste time wondering what might be under the warped boards. He went to the truck, retrieved a pry bar, a flashlight, and a pair of heavier gloves, and returned to the far corner where Rex sat, waiting with disciplined patience. The dog's body was still but charged, muscles subtly flexed beneath his thick sable coat, breath slow, eyes intent. Rex was 6 years old, in the prime of working maturity, his chest broad and deep, his paws oversized for traction on unstable ground. He'd been trained to detect explosives by scent and vibration, to distinguish between danger and harmless clutter, and though those days were behind them, the instincts remained. He did not paw at random. When he chose a spot, it was because something had called to him through layers of noise and decay. Calder wedged the pry bar between two boards and leaned his weight into it. The wood splintered with a brittle crack, nails shrieking as they tore free. Cold air shifted through the gap. He worked methodically, lifting one plank then another, stacking them aside rather than flinging them. Beneath the rotten top layer lay a second structure, thicker beams set closer together. He brushed away debris with the back of his glove and saw the outline of a rectangular seam, iron set into stone. A hatch. Not the flimsy cellar doors of suburban homes, but something built to last. He knelt, pressing his ear close to the seam, then rapped his knuckles against the metal. The echo that answered was deep and hollow, not the short rebound of a shallow crawlspace, but the resonant note of volume. He glanced at Rex. "Looks like your uncle knew more than the lawyer did," he muttered, though whether he meant the dead man or the dog was unclear. The hatch had a rusted ring handle, stiff with age. Calder tugged once, it held fast. He shifted his grip, planted his boots wide, and pulled again. The hinges groaned, flakes of rust falling like dull orange snow. With a reluctant scrape, the hatch lifted. A breath of air rose from below, cool but not damp, scented faintly with earth and old wood. Calder shone the flashlight downward, stone walls, a ladder descending into shadow. He tested the ladder with his boot before committing weight. The wood was old but thick, the rungs worn smooth by years of use. Rex watched from the edge, ears forward, head slightly tilted, as if calculating risk. "Stay," Calder said softly. He descended slowly, one rung at a time, a light beam cutting through dust motes. The space opened around him as his boots touched packed earth. The cellar was larger than he'd expected, roughly 20 feet across and perhaps 15 deep. The ceiling arched in a shallow curve reinforced with heavy timber beams. The stonework was deliberate, fieldstones fitted without visible mortar, their surfaces cold but dry. No seepage marked the walls. The air held steady, insulated from the wind's constant assault above. Calder stood still, listening. The outbuilding creaked overhead, but down here the sound was distant, muffled by layers of soil and stone. He swept the flashlight beam across the perimeter. In one corner stood an old cast-iron stove, squat and thick-legged, its flue pipe leading upward toward what must have been a chimney vent. Nearby, stacked against the wall, were wooden crates collapsed inward from age. A work table leaned crookedly, its surface scarred by cuts and burns. Whoever had built this had not been careless. The proportions suggested forethought, storage for winter, shelter in a region where winter did not forgive mistakes. Rex whined softly from above. Calder looked up. "All right," he called. He climbed halfway up and extended his hand. Rex hesitated only a second before descending, paws careful, claws clicking lightly against the wood. At the bottom he stood tall, nose working, circling the space once before settling beside Calder's leg. His body language shifted, alert, but calm. No immediate threat. Calder walked the perimeter, counting steps. He measured not only space but potential, where to store wood, where to sleep, where to keep heat centralized. He touched the stove, testing its weight. It was heavy but intact. He crouched to examine the flue pipe, tracing its path upward. If the chimney was clear, heat could be managed. If not, it could be cleared. Above them, the wind rose, a low animal howl threading through cracks in the boards. Calder switched off the flashlight for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the faint gray filtering down from the open hatch. The darkness was not oppressive. It was steady, contained. He had known worse places. He climbed back up and surveyed the outbuilding again, this time with a different eye. The structure was failing, yes, but it could serve as a shell, a first barrier against snow. The true strength lay below. He began clearing debris from around the hatch opening, widening the access by removing additional boards. Each plank he salvaged, he stacked neatly. Waste was not an option. As he worked, the crunch of tires on gravel carried through the wind. Rex's head snapped toward the sound before Calder heard it fully. The dog's posture shifted instantly into protective readiness, shoulders squared, stance firm. A truck rolled into the clearing and idled near the gate. The driver stepped out slowly, hands visible, as if aware he was approaching a guarded perimeter. He was a large man in his late 50s, built thick through the chest and shoulders despite a slight stoop that suggested old injuries. His beard was iron gray and full, trimmed but not styled, and his face carried deep lines carved by sun and cold. He wore a canvas work jacket stained with oil, and his boots were scuffed from years of uneven ground. His eyes were dark, watchful rather than hostile. "Didn't think anyone would claim this place," the man called out. His voice was rough, shaped by sawdust and cigarettes. Calder straightened, but did not step back. "It's been claimed." The man approached the gate, stopping short of crossing it. He studied Rex first, then Calder. "Name's Lyle Dorman," he said. "Used to run the mill before it shut down. Walter was particular." Calder nodded once. "Calder Boone." Lyle scratched at his beard. "You planning to live here?" "That's the plan." Lyle glanced at the sagging roof, then at the open hatch behind Calder. His gaze sharpened. "You find it already?" Calder did not answer immediately. Rex gave a low, almost inaudible rumble in his chest, not aggressive but cautionary. Lyle huffed a short laugh. "Relax. I know about the cellar. Walter built it after the winter of '83. The storm collapsed half the mill. He survived because of that hole in the ground." He shifted his weight, favoring one leg slightly, a limp born of an accident long past. "Town thinks it's a relic. I know better." There was no mockery in his tone, only a hard-earned pragmatism. "You here to warn me off?" Calder asked. "Not my business." Lyle's eyes moved again to Rex. Dog yours? Yes. Military? Yes. Lyle nodded slowly. Lost my brother in Afghanistan. Changed the way I look at uniforms. He paused. You'll need wood. Storm coming. 3 days, maybe less. Calder registered the information without visible reaction. Appreciate the heads up. Lyle lingered a moment longer, then stepped back toward his truck. Iron Hollow's not kind to people it doesn't know, he said, but winter's not kind to anyone. You make that cellar work. You might surprise them. When he drove away, the clearing felt larger, emptier. Calder watched until the taillights vanished between the trees. Then he turned back to the task at hand. He descended again into the cellar, this time carrying down the flashlight and a length of rope. Rex followed close behind. Calder inspected the chimney from below, pushing a stick upward through the flue. A cascade of brittle leaves and dust fell back down. The draft was weak but present. It could be improved. He examined the stove's firebox, clearing out old ash with deliberate strokes. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, the same measured cadence he once used assembling gear in dim barracks light. Rex lay near the base of the ladder, head lifted, listening to every sound above and below. By the time darkness fully claimed the clearing, Calder had cleared enough space around the stove to imagine flame. He had not yet committed to staying the night, but the idea no longer seemed reckless. He climbed back up and closed the hatch halfway, leaving a narrow gap for air. The outbuilding groaned under a fresh gust, but the cellar below remained steady. Calder stood in the dim interior, breath fogging, and looked once more at the warped roofline. He could see the coming storm in the way the clouds pressed low and heavy against the hills. He had choices: drive back to town, find a room, wait, or begin now. Rex rose and nudged his leg lightly, a silent vote cast. Calder exhaled slowly. We start tonight, he said. He descended once more into the stone chamber, carrying the first armful of salvaged boards with him, the sound of wind fading behind the closing hatch. Above ground, Iron Hollow tightened itself against the cold. Below, in the dry stillness of stone and earth, a different kind of shelter began to take shape. The storm did not wait for permission. By the time Calder carried the third armful of salvaged boards down into the cellar, the wind had shifted from restless to deliberate, pressing hard against the outbuilding as if testing every weakness at once. Snow rattled across the metal roofing in dry bursts. Inside the stone chamber, however, the air remained still, insulated by earth that had held its shape for decades. Calder set the boards beside the stove and stood for a moment, listening. Not to the weather above, but to the space itself. Stone contracts differently than wood. Air moves in subtle ways when pressure changes. He had learned to read environments the way others read maps. Rex lay near the base of the ladder, body angled toward the hatch, eyes open but not anxious. The dog's thick winter coat had begun to grow in fully. The sable fur along his shoulders darker now, almost black in low light. At 6 years old, Rex carried himself with seasoned confidence. His muzzle had begun to frost lightly with pale hairs, but his movements were precise and economical. A faint scar traced the line of his right foreleg, a souvenir from a deployment Calder did not speak about. The dog rose when Calder crouched near the stove, then settled again once he understood the task. Calder disassembled the flue pipe with careful hands, clearing out remaining debris from inside the joints. The chimney draft, though weak, was workable. He reassembled the pipe, sealing loose seams with strips of cloth torn from an old tarp and packed tight with ash to slow air leaks. He did not rush. Rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes with fire were unforgiving. But he arranged kindling, splintered boards shaved thinner with his knife, dry fragments from crates that had been spared rot. Over that, he stacked heavier pieces in a crosshatch. He struck a match. The flame flared, small and bright, against the dim stone. For a second, he hesitated, measuring oxygen flow, then touched it to the kindling. The fire caught reluctantly at first, smoke curling low and uncertain. Calder watched the draft carefully. The smoke wavered, then began to rise with steadier intention. The chimney exhaled a thin gray ribbon upward. He adjusted the stove's intake vent by a fraction. Rex lifted his head, nostrils flaring once, then relaxed again as the air stabilized. Within 20 minutes, the cellar changed character. The cold did not vanish, but it retreated from sharp to manageable. The stone walls, once indifferent, began to absorb warmth. Calder removed his outer gloves and held his hands near the stove, feeling sensation return fully to his fingers. Above, something cracked loudly, the sound of wood giving way. Rex was on his feet instantly, muscles taut. Calder climbed halfway up the ladder and eased the hatch open an inch. Snow whipped horizontally through the gap. One section of the outbuilding's outer siding had torn free and now flapped violently in the wind. The roofline sagged slightly more than before, but it still held. Calder closed the hatch again and secured it with a length of rope looped through an interior beam. "It won't last the winter," he murmured to Rex, "but it doesn't have to." He spent the next hour clearing additional floor space, establishing a rough division of purpose. Against the far wall, he stacked dry boards in a neat column, away from stray sparks. Near the latter, he set aside an area for sleeping, no more than a rectangle of cleared earth for now. He inventoried what he had in the truck: a wool blanket, 2 military-grade sleeping bags, canned beans, hard bread, water jugs, a compact toolkit, and a small first aid kit. As he carried supplies down, headlights cut briefly through the cracks of the outbuilding. Rex growled low. Calder paused at the top of the ladder and looked out through a narrow seam in the boards. A smaller vehicle had pulled up near the clearing's edge, a faded blue sedan, engine idling uncertainly in the cold. The driver's door opened and a woman stepped out. She moved with quick, purposeful steps, boots crunching sharply against snow. She was in her early 30s, tall and lean, her posture straight despite the wind pushing at her coat. Her hair, dark auburn, was braided tightly down her back to keep it from her face. Her skin was pale from winter, but freckled faintly across the bridge of her nose. Her features were sharp, defined by a high brow and narrow jaw. She wore no visible makeup; the cold would have stripped it away anyway. Determination rather than warmth marked her expression. She approached the gate and called out, her voice steady though not loud. "Mr. Boone?" Calder stepped out from the doorway, leaving Rex inside but visible behind him. "That's me." "I'm Elena Dorman," she said, "Lyle's daughter." Up close, her eyes were a striking gray-green, assessing rather than accusatory. There was something about her composure that suggested long practice at standing alone in rooms that underestimated her. A thin silver ring rested on her left hand, not a wedding band, but something older, worn smooth by habit. "My father said you found the cellar," she continued. "He also said you're planning to stay." "That's right." She glanced at the building, then at the wind-whipped trees beyond. Storm advisory just upgraded to a warning. School closed early. Roads might not be passable by morning. She studied him another second, as if measuring whether he understood what that meant. Walter survived because he knew how to ration heat. If you're using the stove, keep the fire steady, not large. Stone sweats when overheated. Calder regarded her with new attention. "You've been down there." "Once," she replied. "After the mill shut down, Dad thought about using it for storage." A faint pause followed, almost imperceptible. He didn't. There was history in that pause, loss, perhaps regret. Elena did not elaborate, and Calder did not press. Rex emerged behind him, silent but imposing, standing close enough that his shoulder brushed Calder's thigh. Elena's gaze shifted briefly to the dog. Her expression softened, just a fraction. "He's well trained." "He listens," Calder said. "That's rare." The wind tugged at her braid. "You'll need additional water. The pipes in town freeze first thing during these fronts. If you don't have a pump here, melt snow early, not during peak gusts." Calder nodded once. Advice offered without condescension carried weight. "Appreciate it." She hesitated, then added, "Iron Hollow isn't used to outsiders staying, especially not through winter." The faintest ghost of a smile touched her mouth. "But I suppose that's not your concern." "It isn't," he said calmly. Elena seemed to accept that. "Good luck, Mr. Boone." She turned, boots striking a clean rhythm against the snow as she returned to her car. The sedan reversed carefully, headlights swallowed quickly by white wind. Calder stood a moment longer, considering the exchange. Rex watched the retreating lights until they vanished entirely, then looked up at Calder as if awaiting instruction. Inside the cellar again, Calder made small adjustments based on what Elena had said. He moderated the intake vent slightly, letting the fire burn at a controlled pace. He filled a metal bucket with packed snow from outside and set it near, but not too near, the stove to begin melting gradually. He checked condensation along the walls. So far, minimal. The stone felt cool but not damp. Hours passed, measured in tasks rather than minutes. Calder ate sparingly. Half a can of beans warmed over the stove, a slice of bread. He gave Rex a ration from a sealed pouch, watching the dog eat with quiet efficiency before settling near the ladder again. The outbuilding groaned as gusts strengthened, but below ground, the rhythm remained steady. Crackle of wood, faint draft through flue, soft thud of snow accumulating above. Near midnight, a violent shudder rocked the structure overhead. A beam snapped with a sharp final report. Dust sifted down through gaps in the boards. Rex leapt up, barking once, sharp and commanding. Calder climbed quickly but cautiously and pushed the hatch open enough to see. One corner of the roof had collapsed inward, shearing under the weight of fresh snow. The sky above was a whirling white void. He closed the hatch again, without panic. The outbuilding had lost structural integrity faster than anticipated, but the cellar remained untouched. The earth would bear what wood could not. He descended slowly and sat on the cleared section near the stove. Rex came to rest beside him, leaning subtly against his knee. Calder placed a hand on the dog's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath thick fur. Above them, Iron Hollow braced against the storm, unaware that beneath the failing boards, warmth held its ground. Calder looked around the stone chamber at the measured stacks of wood, the careful draft of smoke rising through old masonry. He did not smile. He did not need to. The first fire had held. The cellar had proven its worth. And outside, the winter had only just begun. By dawn, the world above the cellar had disappeared. Snow did not fall in flakes anymore, but in relentless sheets, driven sideways by wind that never seemed to inhale. Calder woke not because of noise, but because of the change in pressure. The kind of instinct that had once pulled him out of shallow sleep in desert outposts now alerted him to the weight gathering overhead. The stove still glowed low and steady. Rex lay near the base of the ladder, head lifted, ears pricked toward the hatch as if he could hear the storm thinking. The air in the cellar held at a tolerable warmth, neither damp nor stifling. Calder rose quietly, adding 2 small logs to the stove, careful not to overfeed it. The flame caught and settled. He checked the bucket of melted snow. Water level adequate, no soot contamination. Where he had learned to trust routine more than optimism. Rex stood and stretched, muscles rippling beneath his thick winter coat. The dog shook once, collar tags clicking softly, then moved to Calder's side. When Calder cracked the hatch open an inch to test conditions, snow forced itself immediately through the gap, swirling downward like a living thing. He shut it at once. The outbuilding roof, already compromised, had partially collapsed during the night. Snow now covered the fallen beams, compressing them into an uneven mound that sealed much of the structure's interior. The cellar, insulated by earth and stone, remained intact, but access to the outside would grow more difficult with each hour. He secured the hatch again and descended. "We hold," he murmured to Rex. The dog's tail gave a single slow sweep against the packed earth. By mid-morning, the storm intensified further. The wind created a constant low-frequency vibration that Calder felt more than heard. He adjusted the stove draft twice to compensate for shifting airflow. He rationed wood carefully. What he had salvaged would not last indefinitely if the storm extended beyond forecast. Near noon, a new sound broke through the white monotony, a dull, uneven pounding from above. Not the rhythmic collapse of timber, not wind-borne debris. Intentional. Rex reacted instantly, barking once, sharp and authoritative, then growling low in sustained warning. Calder raised a hand in silent command. The dog quieted but remained rigid, eyes fixed on the ladder. The pounding came again, weaker this time. Calder moved up carefully, bracing his shoulder against the hatch before easing it open against packed snow. It took effort. The weight above resisted. When the opening finally shifted enough to allow light, a figure slid downward awkwardly, half falling through the gap before catching himself on the edge of the ladder. The man who dropped into the outbuilding wreckage above the hatch was tall but gaunt, as though the storm had already stripped him thin. His beard was dark and untrimmed, flecked with frost, jaw sharp and angular beneath wind-reddened skin. He wore a heavy wool coat crusted in snow, sleeves torn near the cuffs. His hair, black and matted by ice, clung to his forehead. He looked to be in his early 40s, though hardship had aged him. "Don't shoot," he rasped automatically, hands raised though no weapon was visible. Calder studied him for half a second, then stepped aside from the ladder. "Come down slowly!" The man descended with visible effort. His boots slipped once but caught. When he reached the cellar floor, he staggered, catching himself against the stone wall. Rex stood between him and Calder, stance firm, chest forward, assessing scent and movement. The stranger froze at the sight of the dog's teeth, not bared, but implied. "Name's Grant Keller," the man said, breath coming in sharp bursts. His voice carried the rough edge of someone unused to asking for help. Truck went off the road near the ridge, been walking since midnight. Calder watched him closely. Grant's hands were large and scarred, knuckles thickened by old fractures. His left wrist bore a faded tattoo of crossed axes, likely a remnant from logging days. His eyes, dark brown and deeply set, held a mixture of defiance and exhaustion. This was not a man who begged easily. "Any injuries?" Calder asked. "Nothing broken." Grant swayed slightly. "Just cold." Calder motioned toward the stove. "Sit." He retrieved a spare blanket from his duffel and handed it over. Grant hesitated only a moment before accepting it. As he settled near the fire, steam began rising faintly from his coat. Rex approached cautiously, nose extended. Grant stiffened again but did not pull away. The dog sniffed his boots, his gloves, then stepped back. Decision made. Not a threat. "I know who you are," Grant said after a moment, eyes still on the fire. "You're the vet who took Walter's place." "Calder Boone," Grant nodded. "Town's been talking." He coughed, a dry rasp. "They said you'd be gone before first snow." Calder poured water from the melted bucket into a tin cup and handed it to him. "Mum, they were wrong." Grant gave a short, humorless chuckle. "Seems so." As warmth returned to him, Grant's posture shifted from survival instinct to guarded awareness. "I used to run hauling contracts out of Iron Hollow," he said. "After the mill closed, jobs dried up. Folks got tight." His jaw tightened at the memory. "People don't look out for each other much anymore." Calder did not respond. He added another log to the stove, measured and precise. Grant glanced around the cellar, taking in the stonework, the stacked wood, the controlled heat. "Walter showed me this place once," he admitted quietly. "Said it was his insurance policy. Guess he meant it for you." The storm above roared in reply, as if punctuating the statement. Hours passed in uneasy coexistence. Grant regained color slowly. He spoke little, conserving energy. But Rex maintained a watchful distance but did not growl again. Calder kept the stove fed at disciplined intervals, monitoring air quality carefully. 2 men and a dog in a confined stone chamber required balance. Toward late afternoon, another disturbance filtered down through the snow-packed roof. Faint shouting carried on wind. Calder climbed again, this time forcing the hatch open with greater effort. Snow had drifted higher, forming a partial barrier. Through the narrow opening, he saw movement in the white blur. 2 figures struggling against the gale. He descended quickly. "Stay here," he told Grant. Rex followed him up without being asked. Outside the partial wreckage of the outbuilding, visibility was barely 10 feet. Calder wrapped a rope around his waist, anchoring it to an interior beam before stepping out into the storm. Rex moved ahead, nose low, navigating by scent and instinct. Within seconds, they located the figures, a middle-aged couple half buried by drifted snow. The man was broad-shouldered but bent with fatigue, his beard short and trimmed but iced white by frost. His features were square and heavy, eyes narrowed against wind. The woman beside him was smaller, her blonde hair tucked beneath a knit cap, cheeks pale and cracked from cold. They clung to each other more from balance than affection. "Cellar!" Calder shouted, gesturing toward the opening. He secured the rope around the man's torso and guided them step by careful step back to the hatch. Rex circled protectively, barking at gusts as if they were adversaries. Inside, Grant rose unsteadily to assist. Together they lowered the couple into the cellar. The man introduced himself between ragged breaths. "Thomas Hale," he said, "and this is my wife, Miriam." Thomas's voice carried authority, dulled by exhaustion. His hands, though shaking, were steady in placement, suggesting years of manual labor. Miriam's grip on his sleeve remained firm even once seated, her blue eyes wide but resolute. The cellar, once sparse and solitary, now held 4 adults and a K9. Calder immediately adjusted ventilation, cracking the hatch slightly despite the storm to maintain airflow. He increased the stove's burn marginally but not dangerously. Miriam wrapped herself in a blanket, whispering thanks repeatedly. Thomas watched Calder with something like recognition. "You're the Boone boy," he said. "Walter talked about family once." Calder gave no more than a nod. As night deepened, the storm showed no sign of weakening. The outbuilding above was now little more than a snow-capped ruin. Yet beneath it, the stone chamber held. 4 people who would have frozen in open air now sat within its insulated curve. Rex lay near the ladder, vigilant but calm, chest rising and falling in measured rhythm. Calder leaned back against the wall, eyes tracking the subtle glow of embers. He had not planned to shelter anyone but himself and the dog. The decision had been instinctive, not strategic. But as he surveyed the small group, Grant regaining strength, Thomas steadying Miriam's breathing, he understood that the cellar had already become more than a private refuge. Outside, Iron Hollow endured the long white silence of the storm. Below ground, survival had quietly expanded to include others, and the storm had not yet reached its peak. By the second night, the cellar no longer felt like a hidden chamber beneath a ruin. It felt like a held breath. 4 adults and a working K9 occupied a space designed for one man's insurance against winter. The air had changed subtly, thicker, warmer, edged with the scent of damp wool and human proximity. Calder noticed everything. He noticed how condensation gathered faintly along the upper stones when the stove burned too high. He noticed how the draft shifted when the hatch remained sealed too long. He noticed how exhaustion altered posture and made small disagreements sharper. The storm above continued without mercy. Snow pressed downward in silence now rather than rage, as though the violence had settled into weight. Calder rose before the others, feeding the stove with 2 measured pieces of wood and 1 smaller scrap. Rex lifted his head at once, amber eyes alert but calm. The dog had adapted to the increased number of bodies with disciplined restraint. He kept his distance from Grant, but accepted Thomas's presence near the ladder without challenge. Miriam he regarded with a quiet softness, as if sensing fragility. At 6 years old, Rex carried the composure of an animal that understood hierarchy without needing to assert it. Grant had recovered enough strength to stand unassisted. In better light, Calder could see him clearly. Grant's face was angular and hollowed slightly at the cheeks, beard grown uneven and dark against wind-burned skin. A faint scar crossed his right eyebrow, likely from an accident long ago. His hands were rough and cracked, palms thickened by years gripping steering wheels and hauling lines. There was impatience in him, an undercurrent of restlessness that surfaced when he had no immediate task. Hardship had shaped him into someone who equated stillness with vulnerability. Thomas Hale, by contrast, radiated steadiness. In his early 50s, he was broader through the shoulders, beard trimmed neatly even in crisis, gray threading through dark brown. His eyes were a faded blue, observant and measured. He had once run a hardware supply shop in Iron Hollow before the mill closed. Calder learned this in fragments over the course of the morning. When business failed, Thomas adapted quietly, taking seasonal labor, never publicly complaining. Miriam, seated close beside him, was thinner than she should have been for Montana winters, her wrists narrow, her posture straight despite fatigue. Her voice, when she spoke, was gentle but unwavering. She had once taught music at the small-town church before attendance dwindled and funding disappeared. Loss had carved lines near her mouth, but not bitterness. Calder broke the morning silence with practicality. "Ventilation cycle," he said, rising toward the ladder. "We open for 10 minutes every hour." Grant frowned. "In this wind?" "In this air," Calder corrected evenly. "We balance heat and oxygen, or we don't wake up." There was no argument after that. The hatch proved heavier than before. Snow had accumulated, compacting under its own weight. Calder braced his shoulder and pushed upward. The hatch rose only inches, enough to allow a thin blade of light and a slicing gust of cold to enter. Rex stood near his leg but did not attempt to ascend. He trusted Calder's command. As air cycled through the chamber, Thomas shifted Miriam closer to the stove. Grant moved toward the stacked wood, examining it critically. "This won't last another week if the storm doesn't break," he observed. Calder met his gaze. "Then we stretch it." Grant nodded once, not in submission but in acknowledgement. Midday brought another complication. A sharp crack echoed from above, not the dull collapse of old timber, but a clean fracture. The ceiling beams within the cellar trembled slightly. Miriam flinched. Rex stood immediately, ears high. Calder climbed the ladder again, this time forcing the hatch open wider. Snow cascaded inward. Through the gap he saw that a large section of the remaining outbuilding roof had given way completely. Snow now filled the interior above the cellar like a frozen tide. The weight distribution had shifted. What had been overhead structure was now insulation and burden simultaneously. He descended slowly. "Roof's gone," he said plainly, "but snow's packed. It's holding." Thomas inhaled slowly. "You sure about that?" "It's stable for now," Calder replied. "Snow compresses. It can bear itself if undisturbed." Grant rubbed his beard thoughtfully. "Unless it warms." "It won't," Calder said. The temperature outside had dropped further overnight. Warming was not imminent. The conversation settled into silence until another sound intruded, this one unmistakably human. Faint, muffled, distant shouting carried through layers of snow, not from directly above but from beyond the clearing. Rex reacted first, barking sharply toward the hatch. Calder's posture changed instantly, alertness sharpening into decision. He tied the rope around his waist again, looping it twice this time for additional security. Thomas rose. "You can't go out there alone." "I won't," Calder said, glancing at Rex. The dog was already poised at the ladder. Grant stepped forward, jaw set. "I'm coming." Calder assessed him briefly. Grant's color had returned, his stance no longer wavered. "Stay tethered," Calder said finally. "You follow my line." They emerged into a white world that felt narrower than before. Snow reached nearly to Calder's waist in places, sculpted into ridges by relentless wind. Visibility was limited to shapes and movement. Rex forged ahead, nose cutting low arcs through airborne scent. Within minutes, they found the source. A younger man struggling beside a half-buried snowmobile. He was in his late 20s, tall and wiry, face raw with cold, sparse blonde beard clinging to a narrow jaw. His name, shouted between gasps, was Owen Price. He had been attempting to reach his grandmother's cabin when the machine stalled and tipped. Owen's eyes were bright with fear, but stubbornness held him upright. "I can make it," he insisted through chattering teeth. "You won't," Calder replied, securing the rope around him. Grant took Owen's other side, lending weight and leverage. The three men fought the wind together, Rex circling close, guiding by scent and instinct. Each step required calculation. Snow shifted unpredictably beneath them, threatening to swallow boots and ankles alike. The return to the cellar took twice as long as the search. When they finally descended into the stone chamber, Owen collapsed to his knees near the stove. Miriam moved instinctively, pressing a blanket around his shoulders. Thomas offered him a steadying grip. The cellar now held 5 adults and a K9. Air management became critical. Calder increased ventilation intervals, even at the cost of warmth. Grant assisted without complaint, adjusting wood stacks, breaking larger planks into smaller increments to control burn rate. Owen regained speech gradually. He was a mechanic by trade, recently returned to Iron Hollow after working in Billings. His grandmother, he explained, had refused evacuation. "She won't leave her place," he said weakly. "Says storms don't scare her." Thomas's expression darkened slightly. Storms should scare everyone. Night came again, and with it, a new stillness. The wind subsided to a low moan. Snow continued to fall, but gently now. The cellar held steady despite the increased weight above and the added bodies within. Calder recalculated wood reserves silently. At current burn rates, they had 3 days at most. As the group settled, an unspoken shift occurred. Grant no longer regarded Calder as an outsider, but as Axis. Thomas deferred subtly in matters of structure. Even Owen, once defiant, watched for instruction. Rex lay near the ladder once more, head on paws, eyes half closed yet attentive. His presence had become more than protective. It was anchoring. In crisis, people gravitated toward certainty. The dog embodied it. Calder leaned back against the stone wall, exhaustion threading through his limbs but not dulling his mind. He had not intended to build a refuge for Iron Hollow. He had intended only to survive. Yet survival had expanded beyond singular necessity. Above them, snow settled into deeper silence. The outbuilding was gone entirely now, swallowed by white. But the cellar endured, holding weight, holding breath, holding the living. And outside, others might still be walking. The storm did not end so much as thin. By morning, the roar above had softened into a drifting hush, wind reduced to a distant sweep across the hills. Snow still fell, but it fell straight now, no longer weaponized. In the cellar, the air felt different, less urgent, more measured. 5 adults and a dog had passed another night without losing heat or hope, but Calder knew survival had shifted from immediate crisis to difficult endurance. Wood was lower than he liked. Water had to be melted in careful increments. Oxygen cycles required strict discipline. He rose before the others and checked the beams overhead for stress, palm pressed against old timber, feeling for vibration. Nothing new. The snowpack above had stabilized. Rex stood as soon as Calder did, amber eyes alert. At 6, the dog was fully mature, muscles dense under winter coat, but movements fluid despite fatigue. He had not slept deeply in days. He rotated between watch positions, near the ladder, near the stove, near Calder's boots, never fully off duty. His ears tracked subtle sounds none of the others could isolate. When he moved, it was with quiet purpose, as if conserving strength for something still coming. Thomas stirred next, clearing his throat softly so as not to startle Miriam. He pushed himself upright with a controlled effort. Even seated, his posture retained a craftsman's solidity. "Feels different," he said quietly. "It is," Calder replied. Pressures dropped. Grant rolled onto one elbow, eyes narrowing. "Means it's over?" "Means it's shifting." Owen sat up abruptly at that. His youth made him restless. Stillness grated against him like sandpaper. "Then we should move," he said. "Check town. Check my grandmother." Calder did not answer immediately. He climbed the ladder and forced the hatch open with deliberate strength. Snow fell inward in soft cascades, but no gale followed. The world outside had transformed into a landscape of contours and buried shapes. The outbuilding had vanished entirely beneath drifts that rose nearly to the level of the hatch opening. The clearing itself was unrecognizable, edges erased. He descended. "We'll dig a path," he said, "one at a time, tethered." Grant nodded first. Action suited him. Thomas followed without argument. Owen's jaw tightened, eager but uncertain. They began by carving a narrow trench from the hatch outward, using a shovel salvaged from beneath debris and a broken board repurposed as a scoop. Snow was not light. It had compacted under its own weight. What each lift required effort. Rex moved ahead once the first few feet were cleared, testing ground stability, paws sinking but not floundering. He marked subtle depressions where drifts concealed uneven terrain. As they worked, another figure emerged from the white horizon, a dark shape moving slowly, methodically, leaning into a long-handled tool. The man approached with steady determination rather than desperation. He was tall, long-limbed, perhaps in his late 40s, his beard trimmed close along sharp cheekbones, black hair streaked with gray at the temples. His features were narrow and deliberate, eyes dark and observant. He wore a heavy shearling coat and thick gloves, and he carried a snow shovel not as a prop but as extension of self. When he reached the edge of their trench, he paused. "Looks like Walter's bunker earned its keep," he said evenly. Calder studied him. "Name?" "Elias Mercer," the man replied. "Sheriff." His voice carried neither accusation nor warmth. Elias Mercer had the air of someone accustomed to weighing words carefully. His jaw bore a thin white scar near the chin. Knife or accident, Calder could not tell. His posture remained upright despite evident fatigue. Law enforcement in a town like Iron Hollow meant less paperwork and more negotiation. It also meant carrying responsibility long after others slept. "You got more survivors?" Mercer asked. 5 here, Thomas answered before Calder could. Maybe more out there. Mercer nodded once. Town's half buried. 2 roofs collapsed. We're moving people to the community hall, but heat's unreliable. His gaze shifted to the hatch behind them. You're stable? For now, Calder said. Mercer studied the trench, the rope lines, the measured spacing of wood near the entrance. He saw the organization immediately. You military? He asked, though the answer was obvious. Yes. Mercer gave a short nod. Good. There was no time for further introductions. Mercer joined the digging without ceremony, movements economical and practiced. His shovel cut clean lines through packed snow. He worked without complaint, pausing only to assess structural overhangs that might collapse into their trench. As the passage widened, they created a corridor from the cellar toward the ridge road. Grant found renewed purpose in the labor. Owen matched his pace, eager to prove resilience. Thomas moved slower but steady, conserving breath. Rex ranged ahead in short arcs, nose high when wind shifted. Thus midway through the effort, Rex halted abruptly, ears rigid. He barked once, sharply, then began digging at a specific drift 30 yards from the trench. Calder reacted without hesitation, moving toward the spot with shovel in hand. The others followed. Beneath 3 feet of compacted snow lay the curved outline of a vehicle roof. A sedan. Mercer swore under his breath. Together they cleared the driver's side door. It took force to pry it open. Inside sat an elderly woman, upright but pale, wrapped in multiple blankets. Her eyes fluttered open at the sudden light. I told him not to come looking, she whispered faintly. Owen froze. Grandma? He knelt immediately, voice breaking despite effort to steady it. The woman, Eleanor Price, was small and bird-boned, white hair pulled into a thin bun beneath a wool cap. Her face bore fine lines etched by decades of winter sun, but her eyes remained sharp and alert. Stubbornness radiated from her, even in frailty. I've survived worse than snow, she murmured. Calder and Mercer exchanged a brief glance. Hypothermia had not yet claimed her, but it lingered close. They wrapped her in additional layers and secured a rope harness for transport. Owen remained at her side, guiding each step as they moved her carefully toward the cellar. Back underground, Miriam took immediate charge of warming procedures, rubbing Eleanor's hands gently while Thomas adjusted the stove. Grant yielded his blanket without being asked. Mercer remained near the ladder, eyes scanning the ceiling as if expecting the snow to argue. The cellar now held 7 adults and Rex. Air management became more delicate. Calder extended ventilation intervals despite the cold seeping in. He reorganized sleeping positions, placing Eleanor nearest the stove but not directly in line with heat. Mercer assisted in calculating rotation shifts, who would rest, who would monitor. You've done this before, Mercer observed quietly as they worked. Calder did not answer directly. Enough, Mercer accepted that. As evening approached, word traveled through cleared paths. 2 additional townspeople, minor characters, shaken but uninjured, were directed toward the community hall instead of the cellar, as capacity here was nearing limit. Calder made the decision without sentiment. The cellar could not safely hold many more. Outside, the sky shifted toward a pale steel blue as clouds thinned. The worst had passed. Snow lay deep, a reshaping iron hollow into unfamiliar geometry, but the wind had relinquished its grip. Inside the stone chamber, exhaustion mingled with fragile relief. Owen sat beside his grandmother, hand wrapped around hers. Grant leaned back against the wall, eyes closed but not sleeping. Thomas and Miriam shared quiet murmurs near the stove. Mercer stood near the ladder, posture still vigilant, as if law extended even underground. Rex finally lay fully down, chin on paws, though his ears twitched at every minor shift. Calder surveyed the group, counting breath, counting flame, counting wood. The cellar had not collapsed. No one had frozen. The line in the snow had held. Above them, Iron Hollow began the slow process of re-emerging from white silence. Below, in stone and measured firelight, a different kind of community had taken root, unplanned, imperfect, but alive. And for the first time since the storm began, the air did not feel like it belonged to winter alone. When the sun finally broke through, it did so without apology. Light struck the snowfield above the buried outbuilding and turned it into a blinding sheet of silver. From inside the cellar, that change registered first as brightness filtering down the ventilation gap, and second, as a subtle lift in mood among the living. The storm had withdrawn, leaving silence that was not oppressive but tentative. Iron Hollow stood reshaped, roofs bent, fences swallowed, familiar roads reduced to guesses beneath drifts. Calder climbed the ladder early and forced the hatch open with effort, clearing the rim carefully so the compacted snow would not cave inward. Rex ascended behind him in disciplined sequence, paws steady despite the uneven surface. The dog's coat gleamed under the sun, sable fur thickened by cold, amber eyes narrowed against glare. He stood on the ridge of snow that had once been the outbuilding roof, and surveyed the horizon with a soldier's posture. At 6 years old, Rex had the bearing of an animal who understood that survival required vigilance even after apparent calm. The clearing was gone. Only the chimney pipe protruded from the white expanse like a periscope. Calder measured distances mentally, the ridge road, the tree line, the direction of town. Snow lay chest high in places, sculpted by wind into ridges that could conceal sudden drops. He descended and relayed his assessment in simple terms. "Town needs hands," he said. "We rotate shifts. No one moves alone." Sheriff Elias Mercer nodded once. In daylight, his features seemed sharper, carved by responsibility rather than weather alone. His dark eyes tracked logistics instinctively. Who was strong enough to dig? Who needed rest? "Community hall still standing," he said. "Roofs bowed but intact. Generators unreliable. Will need fuel." Thomas Hale volunteered first to head toward town. His broad frame moved slower than before, but steadier. Miriam protested quietly, but Thomas silenced her with a gentle squeeze of her hand. "If we don't help rebuild," he said softly, "we lose more than wood." Grant joined him without hesitation. He had regained full color, beard trimmed roughly with a pocket knife, posture alert. Work steadied him. Without it, the storm lingered too loudly in his head. Owen insisted on accompanying them, determined to prove that his earlier recklessness had not defined him. Eleanor Price remained in the cellar, recovering strength under Miriam's care. Calder organized rope lines from the cellar hatch outward, marking a primary route toward town with salvaged stakes pushed deep into packed snow. Rex led the first stretch, nose cutting through scent layers left by wind and passing boots. His movements were methodical, not frantic. He paused often, testing crust integrity before advancing. They reached the ridge road in under an hour. What had been a narrow track was now a shallow canyon of snow. Further down, figures moved, townspeople digging, shouting instructions. Smoke rose faintly from the direction of the community hall. Among those directing efforts stood a man Calder had not yet met. He was tall and lean, perhaps in his mid-40s, with closely cropped sandy hair and a beard trimmed into precise angles that sharpened his already narrow face. His name, Mercer supplied. Was Daniel Crow, the town's volunteer fire chief. Crow carried himself with a contained urgency, eyes scanning constantly, hands moving in clipped gestures. Years earlier, a warehouse fire had claimed his younger brother, and since then, Crow had approached disaster with relentless control, determined that chaos would never again take him unprepared. Crow studied Calder briefly, taking in the organized rope lines and the K9 at his side. "You're the one using Walter's cellar," he said, not unkindly. "Yes." Crow nodded. "Smart." No further commentary was needed. In crisis, competence trumped history. Work consumed the afternoon. Snow was carved away from doors, pathways reopened, fallen beams dragged aside. Rex proved invaluable. Locating buried tools and once alerting them to a weak section of roof on the hall before it collapsed under added weight. His bark carried urgency without panic. Crow took immediate note of the dog's instincts, adjusting manpower accordingly. Inside the community hall, warmth flickered inconsistently from a generator sputtering on borrowed fuel. Families huddled beneath quilts. Sheriff Mercer moved among them with measured reassurance. Grant found himself coordinating debris removal with surprising authority. Thomas organized tool distribution with the ease of a man who had once managed inventory. Owen ran messages between groups, speed returning to his stride. As dusk approached, Calder returned to the cellar with Rex to check on those remaining. Eleanor sat upright now, color restored, her thin fingers wrapped around a tin cup. Miriam smiled faintly at the sight of them. "She's stronger than she looks," she said. Eleanor's eyes, sharp as flint, fixed on Calder. "I was born in a cabin without heat," she remarked. "Snow doesn't impress me." Calder allowed the corner of his mouth to lift slightly. It impressed the roof. She chuckled once, a dry sound, but genuine. Night settled gently this time, without fury. The cellar held fewer bodies as rotations shifted between it and the hall, but it remained the most reliable shelter. Mercer descended later, brushing snow from his coat. "Town meeting tomorrow," he said quietly. "People need to decide what stays buried and what gets rebuilt." Calder leaned against the stone wall, considering the phrase. "And the cellar?" Mercer regarded him steadily. "You saved lives here. That changes how Iron Hollow sees you." Up above, moonlight struck the snowfield, turning it blue. Rex lay near the ladder, finally resting fully, chest rising in deep, unguarded sleep. For the first time since the storm began, no one kept strict watch. The following morning, townspeople gathered in the cleared square near the hall. Faces that had once regarded Calder with distance now held something closer to recognition. Daniel Crow spoke first, outlining structural repairs needed before another front moved in. Thomas added practical suggestions. Grant proposed clearing timber from the ridge for fuel reserves. Owen stood beside his grandmother, posture steadier than before. When Sheriff Mercer gestured for quiet, he looked directly at Calder. "Walter Boone built that cellar for one man's survival," he said. It became a refuge for many. We have a choice. We can patch roofs and forget, or we can build smarter." A murmur moved through the crowd. Elena Dorman stepped forward then, auburn braid catching winter light. "We convert it," she said clearly. "Reinforce the entrance, install proper ventilation, stock supplies before next winter, make it official." Crow nodded. "I'll oversee structural upgrades." Thomas raised his hand. "I'll source hardware." Grant added, "I'll haul timber." Owen spoke next, voice firm. "I'll maintain the generator." All eyes turned to Calder. He did not step forward theatrically. He simply met their gaze. "It's stone and earth," he said. "It holds if you respect it. Don't overheat it. Don't overcrowd it. Plan before you need it." Silence followed, not uncertain but reflective. Mercer broke it with a short nod. Then we rebuild." By afternoon, tools rang against frozen ground near the buried chimney. Snow was cleared deliberately around the cellar entrance, this time not in desperation, but intention. What had been a hidden survival measure began transforming into a communal safeguard. Calder returned below ground as others worked above, checking the stove, adjusting the flue, ensuring stability. Rex followed him down, tail swaying once before settling. The cellar no longer felt like a refuge carved from crisis. It felt like foundation. Above, Iron Hollow reshaped itself with measured purpose. Below, stone and steady flame remained constant. The storm had come and they had endured. Now, in the clear light after white, they chose what would stand next. The snow did not melt all at once. It receded in stages, first surrendering its sharp edges under a pale sun, then collapsing inward on itself as temperatures rose just enough to loosen its grip. Iron Hollow emerged slowly, as if reluctant to believe the worst had passed. Rooflines reappeared. Fences lifted their crooked ribs above shrinking drifts. The outline of the old outbuilding where Walter Boone had once stored timber remained erased, replaced by a flattened white plateau encircling the exposed chimney pipe and the newly reinforced cellar hatch. Work began before the ground fully thawed. Calder stood at the edge of the cleared perimeter, hands buried in the pockets of his worn jacket, observing rather than commanding. He had not asked for leadership, but leadership had gathered around him the way snow gathered against stone, quietly, inevitably. Rex stood at his side, coat shedding its heaviest winter thickness, amber eyes attentive but relaxed. At 6 years old, the dog moved with balanced strength, no longer braced for crisis, but not surrendering vigilance either. Daniel Crow directed structural reinforcement of the hatch entrance with measured authority. In daylight, Crow's features appeared even sharper, cheekbones high and lean beneath neatly trimmed sandy beard. His posture was straight-backed, almost rigid, shaped by years of volunteer firefighting that had hardened him against panic. The loss of his brother in a warehouse blaze years earlier had carved discipline into him like a brand. Since then, he had built systems where chaos once ruled. He supervised the installation of steel braces around the cellar opening, ensuring the entry could withstand future load without collapse. Thomas Hale oversaw material distribution, calling out measurements with calm precision. He had regained color in his face, shoulders squared once more. Miriam, though still slight, had resumed her quiet influence, organizing food supplies and coordinating meal rotations for workers. Grant Keller hauled timber from the ridge, his movements now purposeful rather than reactive. Owen Price repaired and upgraded the generator at the community hall, returning to his mechanical roots with renewed focus. A new figure arrived 1 week after the storm, a man driving a county-marked pickup bearing the insignia of Glacier County Emergency Management. He stepped out with the measured pace of someone accustomed to surveying aftermath. His name was Victor Halden, a structural engineer assigned to assess storm damage in rural communities. Halden was in his early 50s, tall and spare, with iron-gray hair combed neatly back and a trimmed beard that emphasized a long, angular jaw. His eyes were a muted hazel, analytical rather than emotive. Years of studying failures, bridges, roofs, retaining walls, had trained him to see stress lines where others saw surfaces. He examined the cellar hatch first, crouching to run gloved fingers along the reinforced edges. "You kept the chimney intact," he noted to Crow. Calder answered quietly. "We cleared it early." Halden nodded approvingly. "Good call. Draft stability probably saved you." He requested to descend into the cellar. Calder accompanied him. Rex followed, nails clicking lightly against the new steel threshold. Halden paused halfway down the ladder, glancing at the dog. "He part of your structural team?" he asked dryly. "He found it," Calder replied simply. Inside, Halden surveyed the stonework with professional interest. He tapped along the arch, listening for hollow inconsistencies. He examined timber beams, tested moisture levels along the walls. "Fieldstone without mortar," he murmured. "Uncommon but resilient when properly fitted." He turned toward Calder. "Your uncle understood load distribution." "He understood winter," Calder said. Halden smiled faintly at that. "Same thing here." Above ground, discussions shifted from emergency response to long-term design. The town gathered in the open square, beneath a sky that had softened from steel to blue. Sheriff Mercer stood at the front of the assembly, posture less burdened than before. "We rebuild smarter," he said, echoing earlier words, but this time with plan in hand. Elena Dorman stepped forward beside him, braid resting neatly over one shoulder. She had organized a list of families interested in contributing labor and resources. Her expression held steady resolve. The storm had sharpened her voice, not hardened it. "The cellar becomes phase 1, she said. "Reinforced entry, permanent ventilation shafts, emergency supply cache." Halden offered practical guidance, outlining how to extend the stone chamber slightly without compromising structural integrity. Crow volunteered fire-resistant insulation for upper layers. Thomas secured discounted hardware through old supplier contacts. Grant organized logging shifts to stockpile wood properly seasoned for future winters. Owen proposed installing a secondary exhaust system powered by the refurbished generator, ensuring airflow even if the chimney clogged. Calder listened more than he spoke. When asked for input, he offered it plainly. "No overcrowding beyond calculated capacity, clear rotation plans, monthly maintenance checks, drilled twice a year," Mercer nodded. "Then we formalize it." By late afternoon, iron beams framed the hatch entrance. A modest structure began rising above it, not a full rebuilding of the outbuilding, but a protective shed designed specifically to guard the cellar access. It was pragmatic rather than nostalgic. No one suggested restoring Walter's original mill building. They were not rebuilding memory. They were building function. Rex wandered the perimeter during construction, occasionally pausing beside workers as if supervising. Children from the community hall, newly released from temporary schooling, approached him cautiously. He accepted their presence with patient dignity, lowering his head for gentle touches. The dog had become emblem rather than tool, a reminder that vigilance and loyalty had held when panic might have scattered them. Toward evening, Eleanor Price arrived supported by Owen's arm. She insisted on seeing the progress herself. Her small frame seemed dwarfed by steel and timber, but her gaze remained sharp. "You turned a hole into a promise," she said to Calder. He considered that. "We turned a necessity into a plan." Halden completed his inspection as the sun dipped low. "Structurally sound," he declared. "With reinforcement, it will outlast most buildings here." He extended his hand to Calder, grip firm and dry. "You did more than survive. You demonstrated viability." Calder shook it without flourish. "Stone did that." Night settled differently now. Lights glowed from repaired homes. The community hall hummed steadily under Owen's upgraded generator. The cellar, once hidden, now stood as centerpiece of collective foresight. Its stone walls, warmed gently by controlled fire, no longer symbolized desperation, but preparation. Calder descended alone that evening, Rex following quietly. The chamber felt familiar, yet transformed. Steel braces framed the entrance. New vent shafts angled discreetly upward. Supply shelves lined one wall, already stocked with canned goods and emergency blankets donated by townspeople. He knelt to adjust the stove draft, though it did not need adjustment. Habit persisted. Rex settled beside him, head resting against Calder's knee. Above ground, Iron Hollow no longer looked like a town waiting for rescue. It looked like one that had chosen resilience. Calder leaned back against the cool stone and allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. He had arrived as an outsider inheriting something deemed worthless. He had not intended to remain beyond winter. Yet the cellar, this chamber of stone and earth, had anchored him to more than survival. When he emerged again, moonlight glinted off reinforced beams and freshly cut timber. Voices carried across the clearing. Laughter this time, not alarms. Winter would come again, that was certain. But next time, Iron Hollow would meet it prepared. And beneath the rebuilt hatch, the cellar would hold, not just weight, not just heat, but the quiet confidence of a town that had chosen to endure together. Sometimes, miracles do not arrive with thunder. They do not split the sky or announce themselves in fire. Sometimes a miracle looks like a man who refuses to leave. Sometimes it looks like a loyal dog who stands watch through the coldest night. Sometimes it looks like a cellar of stone, built long ago, forgotten by many, waiting for the exact moment it is needed. In Iron Hollow, no angel appeared in the storm. No voice echoed from the clouds. But courage showed up. Compassion showed up. And when fear knocked on that hatch, it was opened. Maybe that is how God often works, not always by changing the storm, but by strengthening the hands that hold the door open. Maybe the quiet miracle was not the stone cellar. Maybe it was the choice to care for others when no one was watching. Maybe it was the reminder that even when the world feels buried in snow, we are never meant to endure it alone. In our everyday lives, the storms look different. Financial struggles, loneliness, illness, doubt. But the same truth remains. When we choose kindness, when we choose courage, when we choose to stand instead of turn away, we become part of someone else's miracle. And maybe that is what faith really looks like. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We would love to pray for your country and your family. If you believe that God still works through ordinary people in extraordinary moments, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more stories of quiet strength. May God bless you, protect your home, guide your steps, and place warmth in your life even during your coldest seasons. And may you always be someone else's shelter when the storm comes.